Imagine this, May 1945. World War II has just ended. Europe is in ruins, millions are dead, and survivors are only beginning to process the devastation. Yet deep beneath London, British military planners are already sketching blueprints for World War III. This isn't a distant hypothetical, it's a real plan for an imminent attack on the Soviet Union, their own wartime ally. The plan is codenamed Operation Unthinkable. Its very name reveals the horror and audacity of the idea. While the public celebrates peace, Prime Minister Winston Churchill is gripped by a new fear that the Soviets, not the Nazis, now threaten Europe's freedom. Operation Unthinkable is a detailed top-secret strategy for a massive surprise assault on Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. The plan considers troop numbers, supply lines, and battlegrounds, turning yesterday's allies into tomorrow's enemies. When the documents were finally declassified decades later, they shocked historians, revealing how quickly the Grand Alliance fractured. The seeds of the Cold War were sown in the final days of World War II, watered by deep mistrust between East and West. History, it turns out, is far more dangerous and complex than we're often told. Operation Unthinkable marks the moment the alliance against Hitler dissolved into suspicion and rivalry. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin had presented a united front, but beneath the surface, deep ideological divides simmered. This plan was the first Western blueprint for war against the Soviet Union, transforming political disagreements into military confrontation. Churchill saw the Red Army not as liberators, but as occupiers, replacing one tyranny with another. The shift from ally to adversary was swift and shocking. For years, the Soviets were hailed as heroes. Now, in secret, they were recast as the next great threat. Operation Unthinkable exposes the reality of geopolitics. Alliances are temporary, built on shared threats, and dissolve when those threats disappear. The plan closes the chapter on World War II and opens the first page of the Cold War. It proves the Iron Curtain wasn't just a metaphor, it was a real possibility, planned for in the spring of 1945. The mistrust between West and East was never just post-war fallout, it was there all along, waiting to erupt. The world was already bracing for a new kind of conflict. In spring 1945, Europe lay in ruins, cities destroyed, millions displaced, and economies shattered. Allied and Soviet armies advanced from opposite directions, dividing the continent. Churchill watched as Stalin built a buffer of satellite states, extending Soviet power. Fearing a new tyranny, Churchill demanded a bold plan, knowing the fate of millions hung in the balance. In May 1945, just weeks after victory in Europe, Churchill ordered his chiefs to prepare for war with the Soviet Union, the goal to force the Red Army out of Eastern Europe and impose the will of the West. The planners worked fast, but the numbers were grim. The Soviets outnumbered the Allies more than 2-1. Their report warned that an attack would likely lead to a long, devastating war, with little chance of quick success. The Soviets could retreat deep into their territory, dragging out the conflict for years. This was not the answer Churchill wanted, but the military reality was undeniable. Then, in July 1945, Churchill was voted out of office. The new Labour government had no appetite for another war. Operation Unthinkable was quietly shelved, its details locked away for decades. The plan became a forgotten footnote until its secrets were finally revealed. The world had come perilously close to a new war before the last one had even ended. The fate of Europe, and perhaps the world, had hung on a handful of decisions in a few tense weeks. Sometimes, history turns on what leaders choose not to do. One of the most shocking aspects of Operation Unthinkable was the proposal to rearm German soldiers, fighting alongside their former enemies against the Soviets. This desperate measure showed just how outnumbered the Allies felt. The plan also called for Polish forces, eager to free their homeland from Soviet control. But the human factor was daunting. Allied troops were exhausted, promised a return home, and morale was dangerously low. The idea of turning around to fight the Red Army was unthinkable for most soldiers. Desertion and mutiny were real concerns. Public support for another war was almost non-existent. The British Isles themselves were vulnerable to Soviet air and rocket attacks. The planners painted a bleak picture: a long, unwinnable war, unreliable allies, and a battered home front. In the end, military inferiority and low morale made the operation truly unthinkable. The world was spared another catastrophe, barely. Operation Unthinkable was never launched, but its shadow shaped the next 40 years. The plan confirmed Western fears. The Soviets were not partners for peace, but rivals to be contained. This mindset led directly to the Cold War's defining strategies and alliances. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 1946 was the public echo of the fears behind Unthinkable. The division of Europe became permanent, with NATO formed to deter Soviet aggression. The plan's lessons drove the West to rely on nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent. When the US tested its first atomic bomb in July 1945, the balance of power shifted. The nuclear arms race began as the Soviets rushed to build their own bomb. The world entered a new era, where the unthinkable was no longer a conventional war but nuclear annihilation. The legacy of mistrust and fear outlived the plan itself. The choices made in those secret rooms shaped the world for generations. Looking back on Operation Unthinkable, we see how fragile peace truly is. Even at moments of triumph, the seeds of future conflict are sown. The plan shows how quickly alliances can crumble, replaced by suspicion and rivalry. It's a sobering reminder. Peace requires constant effort, diplomacy, and restraint. Churchill's fears were real, but the planners' grim assessment helped avert disaster. Sometimes the bravest choice is not to go to war. Operation Unthinkable humanizes history. Leaders facing impossible choices, soldiers exhausted and uncertain. It reminds us that history is shaped by people, not just grand narratives. The world came closer than we realized to a new tragedy. Remembering Unthinkable is a lesson in the dangers of mistrust and the value of peace.